Russia covers more than 17 million square kilometers. That is roughly 1/8 of all the land on Earth, spread across 11 time zones. When it is 8 in the morning in Kaliningrad on the Baltic coast, it is already 7 in the evening in Kamchatka on the Pacific. The country shares borders with 14 nations. It touches the Arctic Ocean in the north and the Caspian Sea in the south. The distance from the western border to the eastern tip is greater than the distance from London to New York. Most people who have never been to Russia picture two cities, Moscow and Saint Petersburg. Both are worth seeing, and both appear later in this journey. But they represent a small fraction of what Russia actually contains. There are places in this country that most Russians have never visited. Regions where the nearest town is several days away by road, where winter lasts 9 months, and where the landscape looks nothing like anything in Europe or Central Asia. Some of these places have no roads at all. Russia is also a country of unusual contradictions. In one region, you find Buddhist temples on flat steppe. In another, ancient burial crypts carved into Caucasus hillsides. In a third, a desert surrounded by snowfields. These are not tourist constructions. They are simply what happens when one country occupies this much space. The journey in this video starts in the Far East and moves westward, ending at the Baltic coast. It covers volcanoes, frozen lakes, the oldest mountains in Europe, the longest river on the continent, and two cities that shaped the course of world history. It does not cover everything. No single video could. The coldest permanently inhabited place on Earth is in Russia. The town of Oymyakon in Yakutia has recorded temperatures of -71 degrees Celsius. In winter, car engines are left running around the clock because a stopped engine may not restart until spring. Eyelashes freeze within minutes outside. The ground beneath the town is permafrost, and has been for thousands of years. Russia contains approximately 20% of the world's unfrozen fresh water. Most of it is in a single lake, Baikal, in southern Siberia. The lake is over 25 million years old, making it the oldest lake on Earth. It is also the deepest, reaching 1,642 meters at its lowest point. The country has more time zones than any other nation, but some remote communities don't officially observe any of them. They use Moscow time by default, even though Moscow may be 8 or 9 hours behind. Flights, schools, and government offices all run on a clock set thousands of kilometers away. During the Cold War, dozens of Russian cities were removed from official maps. They had no names in public records, no existence in any directory. People who lived in them carried special internal passports and needed government permission to leave. Some of these cities are still closed to outsiders today. Russia was the first country to send a human being into space. It was also the first to send a satellite, a spacewalking cosmonaut, and a space station into orbit. In the 1980s, it built a fully functional reusable space shuttle called Buran. The shuttle completed one unmanned orbital flight, landed automatically, and was then grounded permanently when funding collapsed. The aircraft still exists, sitting in a hangar. Kamchatka sits at the far northeastern edge of Russia, jutting into the Pacific Ocean between the Bering Sea and the Sea of Okhotsk. There are no roads connecting it to the rest of the country. The only way in is by plane or boat, which means most Russians have never been here, and most people outside Russia have never heard of it. The peninsula is roughly the size of California. It has around 300 volcanoes, of which 29 are currently active. Mount Klyuchevskaya, the tallest, stands at 4,750 meters and erupts on a regular basis. Ash clouds from its eruptions have forced flight diversions across the North Pacific. The mountain has been erupting, with occasional pauses, for about 7,000 years. The landscape around the active volcanoes shifts constantly. Lava flows cool into black fields that stretch for kilometers. Steam vents open and close in the hillsides. Rivers run warm where they pass over geothermal ground. In winter, snow covers all of it, and the contrast between white slopes and dark volcanic rock gives the peninsula a visual quality that photographs struggle to capture accurately. Brown bears are common here. The peninsula has one of the highest densities of brown bears anywhere on Earth. They congregate along rivers during the salmon run each summer, fishing in the shallows in numbers that are unusual to see. The bears have little reason to fear humans, because in most of Kamchatka, there are almost no humans to fear. In a deep canyon in the center of the Kamchatka Peninsula lies the Valley of Geysers, the second largest concentration of geysers in the world after Yellowstone. There are roughly 90 geysers here, along with hundreds of hot springs, mud pools, and steam vents spread across 6 kilometers of river valley. The valley cannot be reached by road or on foot from any nearby settlement. The only access is by helicopter, which limits visitor numbers significantly. On most days, the valley sees fewer visitors than a small city museum. The geysers erupt on their own schedules, some every few minutes, others every few hours, with columns of hot water reaching up to 40 meters. In 2007, a landslide buried a section of the valley under mud and rock, damming the river and flooding several of the major geysers. Scientists predicted the valley might never fully recover. Within a few years, water cut through the dam, the flood receded, and most of the geysers resumed erupting. The valley restored itself without any human intervention. The surrounding area is home to Steller's sea eagles, which have wingspans of up to 2.5 meters and are among the largest eagles in the world. They nest in the cliffs above the valley and hunt along the river below. From a helicopter approaching the valley, they are sometimes visible soaring at eye level before the steam vents come into view. The Kolyma Highway runs roughly 2,000 kilometers through northeastern Siberia, connecting Magadan on the Sea of Okhotsk to Yakutsk in the interior. It was built between the 1930s and 1950s by prisoners of the Gulag system under Stalin. Estimates of the number who died during construction range from tens of thousands to several 100,000. The permafrost made burial impossible in many places, and bodies were incorporated into the road itself. This is why it became known as the Road of Bones. The highway still exists and is still used. Trucks carry supplies along it to remote settlements that have no other connection to the outside world. In summer, sections of the road turn to mud as the top layer of permafrost thaws, making passage slow and sometimes impossible. In winter, the ground freezes solid and driving becomes easier, but temperatures can drop below -50 degrees Celsius and breakdowns in remote sections can be fatal. The towns along the route were mostly built to support the labor camps. Some were abandoned when the camps closed. Others survived and are still inhabited, their populations much smaller than at their peak. The architecture is functional Soviet. Concrete blocks designed for extreme cold, painted in colors that have faded over decades. The landscape the road passes through is enormous and empty. Larch forest stretches in every direction, broken occasionally by frozen rivers and low hills. In summer, the forest floor is wet, and the mosquitoes are present in numbers that make outdoor work difficult. In winter, the trees stand bare against skies that turn extraordinary colors during the brief hours of daylight. Along the Lena River in the Sakha Republic, a series of limestone rock formations rise from the riverbank to heights of up to 300 meters. They stretch for roughly 80 kilometers, standing in rows and clusters that from a distance resemble the ruins of a city built at an impossible scale. Up close, the stone is layered and fractured, with vertical cracks running from base to top where frost has split the rock over thousands of winters. The pillars began forming around 500 million years ago when this region was covered by a shallow sea. The sea floor accumulated layers of sediment that eventually compressed into limestone. When the land rose and the sea retreated, the Lena River began cutting through the stone. The formations that remain are what the river left behind after millions of years of erosion. There are no roads to the pillars. Reaching them requires a boat journey up the Lena, which is one of the 10 longest rivers in the world. The river is wide and slow in this section, and the journey takes the better part of a day from the nearest town. In winter, the river freezes solid and can be crossed by vehicle, but the pillars themselves are buried under snow and difficult to access. The area around the pillars has been a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 2012. It is also a significant fossil site. Woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, and other Ice Age fauna have been found preserved in the permafrost along the Lena Valley, some in near-perfect condition due to the cold. In the Zabaikalsky Krai region of eastern Siberia, surrounded by mountain ranges, taiga forest, and snowfields, there is a patch of sand dunes covering around 50 square kilometers. It is called the Chara Sands, and it has no obvious explanation. The dunes reach heights of up to 80 meters. The sand is fine and pale, shaped by wind into the same ridge and trough formations found in the Sahara or the Arabian Peninsula. In summer, the surface temperature of the sand can reach 50 degrees Celsius. In winter, the same dunes are covered in snow, and the temperature drops to -40. The contrast between the dune landscape and the snow-capped mountains visible on all sides is jarring in a way that takes time to process. Geologists believe the sand originated from the bed of an ancient glacial lake that dried up thousands of years ago. Wind gradually moved the sediment and concentrated it in its current location. The surrounding taiga has not reclaimed the dunes, partly because the sand drains water so quickly that trees cannot establish root systems at the dune edges. Reaching the Chara Sands requires significant effort. The nearest railway station is in the town of Chara, from which the dunes are accessible by a combination of off-road vehicle and a walk through wetland and forest. The route crosses several rivers that have no bridges. In spring and early summer, flooding makes the approach impassable for weeks at a time. Few visitors make the journey, which means the dunes remain in near pristine condition. There are no facilities, no markers, and no maintained paths. The landscape looks the same as it would have 1,000 years ago. Lake Baikal sits in a rift valley in southern Siberia, about 5 hours by train from the nearest large city, Irkutsk. It is the oldest lake on Earth, formed around 25 million years ago when the ground along a fault line began to pull apart. Most lakes last a few thousand years before they fill with sediment and disappear. Baikal has persisted long enough to develop its own ecosystem, with over 3,000 species of plants and animals found nowhere else on the planet. The lake holds roughly 20% of the world's unfrozen surface fresh water. That is more than all 5 of the North American Great Lakes combined. The water is unusually clear. In winter, when the ice is transparent, visibility can reach 40 meters straight down. The ice itself is up to 2 meters thick in the coldest months, strong enough to support the weight of vehicles. A road is plowed across it each winter, connecting communities on the western shore to the town of Olkhon Island. Baikal is also the deepest lake in the world. At its lowest point, it reaches 1,642 meters, which is deeper than most areas of the Mediterranean Sea. The lake floor has never been fully mapped. The deepest sections are difficult to reach even with modern equipment, and scientists continue to find new species in the sediment layers at the bottom. The freshwater seal, known as the nerpa, lives only in Baikal. How a seal species arrived in a landlocked lake in the middle of Siberia is still debated. The most widely accepted theory is that they migrated from the Arctic Ocean along ancient river systems during the last ice age, when water levels and river connections were different from today. In winter, the ice makes sounds. The lake expands and contracts with temperature changes, and the pressure creates deep, booming cracks that carry for long distances across the surface. People who camp on the ice describe it as one of the more unsettling natural sounds they have heard. The Altai Mountains occupy the point where Russia, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and China come together. The range runs for roughly 2,000 kilometers, with the highest peaks on the Russian side reaching above 4,000 meters. Mount Belukha, the tallest, stands at 4,506 meters and is permanently glaciated. It sits almost exactly on the border between Russia and Kazakhstan. The landscape varies significantly with elevation. The lower valleys contain rivers fed by glacial meltwater, their color a pale turquoise from the rock flour suspended in the water. Above the valleys, forest gives way to alpine meadow, then to rock and ice. The Katun River, which begins near the base of Belukha, runs for nearly 700 kilometers before joining the Ob River system that eventually drains into the Arctic Ocean. The Altai has been inhabited for a very long time. Scythian burial mounds, known as kurgans, are scattered across the region and date back more than 2,500 years. Some of the mounds have yielded remarkably preserved remains due to the permafrost conditions in the burial chambers. Tattoos, clothing, and wooden artifacts have survived intact. The most famous find, known as the Ice Maiden, was a young woman found in a kurgan in 1993, preserved well enough that researchers could reconstruct details of her appearance and burial rituals. Indigenous Altayan communities still live in parts of the range, maintaining traditions of herding and seasonal migration that have continued for centuries. Some practice a form of shamanism that predates the arrival of Buddhism and Islam in the region. Sacred sites, marked by cairns and tied cloth offerings, are distributed throughout the high passes and valley floors. The night sky in the Altai is among the clearest in Russia. The combination of high altitude, low population density, and distance from any major city means that on clear nights, the Milky Way is visible as a distinct band across the full width of the sky. The Ural Mountains run for roughly 2,500 kilometers from the Arctic Ocean in the north to the Kazakh steppe in the south. They form the conventional boundary between Europe and Asia, which means that crossing them in either direction is technically a continental transition. In practice, it happens gradually, over several hours of driving through forest, with no dramatic moment where one continent ends and another begins. The Urals are old. Geologically, they formed around 300 million years ago, which makes them roughly 6 times older than the Alps and 10 times older than the Himalayas. Millions of years of erosion have worn them down considerably. The highest peak, Mount Narodnaya, reaches only 1,895 meters. By the standards of younger mountain ranges, they are modest in height but extraordinary in age. The rock contains significant mineral deposits, including emeralds, malachite, topaz, and gold. The region around Yekaterinburg was a major center of gem and metal extraction for centuries, and several museums in the area hold collections of Ural minerals that are among the finest in the world. The Dyatlov Pass incident took place in the northern Urals in February 1959. Nine experienced hikers died under circumstances that were never satisfactorily explained. The tent was found cut open from the inside. The bodies were scattered across a wide area, some with injuries that could not be attributed to the terrain. The official investigation was closed without a clear conclusion. Theories about what happened have accumulated for decades, ranging from an avalanche to a military accident to explanations that are less straightforward. The pass was named after the group's leader, Igor Dyatlov, and the area around it remains one of the more discussed unsolved events in Russian history. Yekaterinburg sits almost exactly on the boundary between Europe and Asia. A granite obelisk on the city's outskirts marks the official division, and local residents occasionally visit it to stand with one foot on each continent. The gesture is partly ironic and partly genuine. The line is arbitrary in geological terms, but it has been drawn here for long enough that it has become real through repetition. The city was founded in 1723 as an industrial center for processing Ural metals and minerals. It grew into one of the major cities of the Russian interior, and today has a population of around 1.5 million. The center has a mix of 19th-century merchant architecture, Soviet-era civic buildings, and glass towers from the post-Soviet period. The Iset River runs through the middle, lined with parks that are crowded in summer and largely empty in winter. In July 1918, the last Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, was executed here along with his wife, 4 daughters, and son. They had been held under house arrest in a merchant's house after the Bolshevik Revolution. On the night of the 16th and 17th of July, the family and their remaining servants were taken to the basement and shot. The house was demolished in 1977 on the orders of the local Communist Party leadership. A church now stands on the site, built after the fall of the Soviet Union. It draws a steady stream of visitors throughout the year. Yekaterinburg is also the point where the Trans-Siberian Railway effectively transitions from European Russia to Siberia. Passengers heading east from here enter a stretch of track that continues for thousands of kilometers before the next major city. Sochi stretches along the Black Sea coast at the base of the Western Caucasus Mountains. The latitude is roughly the same as the south of France, and the climate reflects that. Palms, fig trees, and eucalyptus grow along the seafront. The sea stays warm enough to swim in from May through October. In winter, when most of Russia is frozen, Sochi remains mild and wet, with temperatures rarely dropping below 5 degrees Celsius at sea level. The city became Russia's main resort destination during the Soviet period, when it was developed as a place for workers to take their annual leave. Sanatoria and rest houses were built along the coast in the 1930s and 40s, some in a grandiose neoclassical style that still defines stretches of the seafront. The tradition of summer holidays in Sochi continued after the Soviet Union collapsed, and the city remains one of the most visited destinations in Russia. In 2014, Sochi hosted the Winter Olympics. The games required the construction of an entirely new sports infrastructure in the mountains above the city, connected to the coast by a new road and railway. The Olympic Park on the coast held the ice events. The mountain cluster at Krasnaya Polyana, 40 kilometers inland and at significantly higher elevation, held the snow events. The distance between venues meant that spectators could watch a skiing event in the morning and a skating event in the afternoon on the same day. Above the coastal strip, the Caucasus Mountains rise steeply. At Krasnaya Polyana, the peaks surrounding the valley reach above 2,000 meters and hold snow from November through April. The combination of subtropical coast and alpine mountains within a short distance of each other is unusual, and it gives Sochi a range of landscapes that most cities of similar size do not have. Mount Elbrus stands at 5,642 meters, making it the highest peak in Europe by the most widely accepted definition of the European boundary. It is also one of the 7 summits, the highest mountains on each of the 7 continents. The mountain is a dormant volcano, with twin peaks separated by a saddle at around 5,300 meters. The last significant eruption occurred approximately 2,000 years ago, but geothermal activity continues, with warm ground and sulfur emissions detectable in places on the upper slopes. The standard route to the summit starts from a cable car system on the southern slope that carries climbers to around 3,900 meters. From there, a combination of snowcat vehicles and climbing on foot takes climbers to the high camps. The final section to the summit is a long walk across snow and ice at extreme altitude. The route is not technically difficult by the standards of high-altitude mountaineering, but the altitude affects climbers regardless of fitness level, and weather on the upper mountain changes rapidly. Several hundred people have died on Elbrus, most from altitude sickness, exposure, or disorientation in storms. The villages in the valleys below Elbrus are home to the Balkar and Karachay peoples who have lived in the Caucasus for centuries. The architecture of the old settlements includes stone defensive towers built several hundred years ago to protect against raids. Some of these towers still stand in the upper valleys, their walls intact despite centuries of Caucasus winters. The north side of Elbrus, less visited than the south, offers views across a high plateau toward the main Caucasus Range. On clear days, the line of peaks extending east and west is visible for hundreds of kilometers. In a valley in North Ossetia, about 40 kilometers from the regional capital Vladikavkaz, a hillside is covered with small stone structures that look like miniature houses or truncated towers. There are around 100 of them, arranged in rows across the slope. They are burial crypts, built between the 14th and 18th centuries by the Ossetian people as a place to inter their dead. Each crypt was designed to hold multiple generations of the same family. Bodies were placed inside along with personal belongings, weapons, and in some cases small wooden boats. The presence of boats in a mountain community with no navigable water nearby has never been fully explained. One interpretation is that they were intended for a journey in the afterlife. Another is that they reflect distant cultural memory from a time when the ancestors of the Ossetians lived near water. The site is known locally as the City of the Dead. For a long time it was considered dangerous to visit, and local tradition held that anyone who entered would not return. The belief kept the crypts largely undisturbed for centuries, which is part of why so much has survived intact. The structures are made from dry stacked stone without mortar, and the preservation of the contents inside owes much to the cold, dry mountain air. The valley around Dargavs is narrow and steep-sided. The road to the site is unpaved for the final section. The surrounding peaks hold snow for most of the year, and the combination of the gray stone crypts against the mountain backdrop gives the place a visual quality that photographs reproduce accurately, but that is different to experience in person. Derbent sits on the Caspian coast at the point where the Caucasus Mountains come closest to the sea, leaving a narrow corridor between the peaks and the water. The city has been continuously inhabited for over 5,000 years, making it the oldest city in Russia and one of the oldest in the world. The corridor it occupies was a strategic choke point on the route between the steppe of Central Asia and the Middle East, and empires fought over it repeatedly throughout history. The most visible surviving structure is a set of walls built by the Sasanian Persian Empire in the 6th century. The walls were designed to block the corridor entirely, running from a hilltop citadel down to the sea. The citadel, known as the Naran-Kala fortress, is still largely intact. Its walls are up to 3.5 meters thick and enclose an area large enough to have contained a small city on their own. The walls running down to the sea have been partially reconstructed, and the line they once formed is still traceable across the landscape. The old city below the fortress contains narrow stone alleys, a medieval mosque that is one of the oldest in Russia, synagogues from the community of mountain Jews who have lived in the region for over 2,000 years, and Armenian and Orthodox churches. The combination of Islamic, Jewish, and Christian architecture within a small area reflects the succession of powers and populations that have passed through the city. The surrounding region produces pomegranates, figs, and grapes. The local wine tradition predates the arrival of Islam in the area and has continued without significant interruption despite the religious prohibition. Markets in the Old City sell dried fruits and preserves that are particular to this part of the Caucasus and not found elsewhere in Russia. The Volga is the longest river in Europe, running 3,530 kilometers from its source in the Valdai Hills northwest of Moscow to its delta on the Caspian Sea. It drains a basin covering around 1/3 of European Russia and has been the main transportation artery of the region for as long as people have lived here. The river was the commercial highway of medieval Russia. Goods moved along it in both directions, furs and timber heading south toward the Caspian and the trade routes to Persia and Central Asia, and spices, silk, and silver coming north. The cities that grew along its banks, Tver, Yaroslavl, Nizhny Novgorod, Kazan, Samara, Volgograd, developed because of the traffic the river carried, and most of them still exist in roughly the locations where they were founded. Today, the Volga is heavily modified. A series of reservoirs created by dams built during the Soviet period have altered the river's flow significantly. The dams generate hydroelectric power and control flooding, but they also blocked the migration routes of sturgeon, which were once abundant in the river and are now endangered. The Volga-Caspian sturgeon fishery, which produced most of the world's caviar for centuries, has collapsed almost entirely. In summer, cruise ships travel the length of the river between Moscow and Astrakhan near the Caspian Delta. The journey takes around 2 weeks and passes through a landscape that shifts from the forested north to the increasingly open and dry terrain of the lower reaches. Church towers and monastery walls appear above the riverbanks at intervals, marking the towns that have faced the water for centuries. The river freezes in winter across most of its length. In the coldest months, ice fishing is practiced on the frozen surface, with small tents set up over holes drilled through the ice. The practice continues in temperatures that would make outdoor activity difficult elsewhere, reflecting the general Siberian attitude toward winter, which is to proceed regardless. Kazan sits on the Volga about 800 kilometers east of Moscow. It is the capital of the Republic of Tatarstan, a region with its own language, culture, and history that has been part of Russia since the 16th century. The city is home to roughly equal numbers of ethnic Russians and Tatars, and the two communities have lived alongside each other here long enough that the boundary between them is often fluid in daily life. The Kazan Kremlin stands on a hill above the Volga and contains both a Russian Orthodox cathedral and a large mosque within the same fortress walls. The cathedral was built in the 16th century, after Ivan the Terrible captured the city from the Kazan Khanate. The mosque, the Kol Sharif, was rebuilt in the early 2000s on the site of a mosque destroyed during the same conquest. The two buildings face each other across a courtyard. The Kremlin is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The city has a significant student population and a reputation for science and technology. Kazan Federal University, founded in 1804, is one of the oldest in Russia. Leo Tolstoy studied here, though briefly and without distinction. The mathematician Nikolai Lobachevsky, who developed non-Euclidean geometry, spent most of his career at the university. The institution still functions as a major research center. Tatar food is distinct from Russian cuisine. Ekpochmak, a triangular pastry filled with meat and potato, is sold in bakeries throughout the city. Chak-chak, a honey-soaked fried dough, appears at most celebrations and is made in quantity for export. The food reflects the city's position between the culinary traditions of Russia to the west and Central Asia to the east. Suzdal sits about 200 kilometers northeast of Moscow, in a flat river valley surrounded by fields. It has fewer than 10,000 residents. It also has more than 30 functioning churches, 5 monasteries, and a Kremlin. The concentration of religious architecture relative to population size is unusual anywhere, and in Russia it is unique. The town was one of the most important centers of medieval Rus before Moscow rose to prominence. It was a seat of princes and bishops, a place where major political and religious decisions were made. Then the main trade routes shifted, the railway bypassed it in the 19th century, and Suzdal stopped growing. The factories and apartment blocks that define most Russian cities never arrived. The wooden houses, monastery walls, and onion domes remained. Walking through Suzdal today, the skyline contains no building taller than a church tower. In winter, smoke rises from chimneys and the snow covers the paths between the monasteries. In summer, the meadows around the Kremlin fill with wildflowers, and the rivers that wind through the town reflect the domes above them. The Kremlin at the center dates from the 11th century. The Cathedral of the Nativity inside it has exterior walls covered in carved stone detail that has survived 800 years of Russian weather. The interior contains frescoes from the 13th century, their colors faded but still distinct. Sergiev Posad is about 70 kilometers northeast of Moscow. The town exists primarily because of the Trinity Lavra of St. Sergius, the most important monastery in the Russian Orthodox Church, which sits at its center. The monastery was founded in the 14th century by Sergius of Radonej, a monk who became the most venerated saint in Russian Orthodoxy. The complex that developed around his original wooden church now covers several hectares and includes cathedrals, bell towers, residential buildings for monks, and facilities for the thousands of pilgrims who arrive each week. The blue domes of the Assumption Cathedral, decorated with gold stars, are visible from the approaches to the town. The monastery remained active through the Soviet period, when most religious institutions in Russia were closed or converted. It functioned as a place of worship continuously, which is one reason its collections of icons, manuscripts, and religious artifacts are among the most complete in Russia. The icon painter Andrei Rublev worked here in the early 15th century, and several of his works remain in the monastery's collections. Pilgrims arrive daily from across Russia and from Orthodox communities around the world. The combination of active religious practice and historical significance gives the monastery an atmosphere that preserved sites often lack. Moscow has a population of around 12 million within the city limits, making it the largest city in Europe. It has been the capital of Russia, with one significant interruption, since the 15th century. The interruption was Saint Petersburg, which served as capital from 1712 to 1918, when the Soviet government moved back to Moscow, partly for strategic reasons, and partly because St. Petersburg felt too European. The historic center is compact enough to walk, though most residents use the metro. The metro system opened in 1935 and was designed as much for display as for transportation. The stations on the original lines have marble floors, bronze chandeliers, and mosaic ceilings depicting Soviet ideals. They were intended to demonstrate that the Soviet Union could build things as impressive as anything in the capitalist world, and in terms of the stations themselves, the point is well made. Red Square sits at the center of the old city, flanked by the Kremlin walls on one side and the gum department store on the other. St. Basil's Cathedral stands at the southern end, its colored domes a design that has no obvious precedent in Russian or Byzantine architecture. It was built in the 1560s to commemorate the capture of Kazan and has been a symbol of Moscow ever since. Lenin's mausoleum sits against the Kremlin wall in the square, still containing the preserved body of the Soviet leader. It remains open to visitors on certain days. The 7 Stalinist skyscrapers, built between 1947 and 1953, are distributed around the city at points chosen to be visible from the center. They share a common architectural language of stepped towers and Soviet decoration, and their scale was deliberately chosen to be comparable to the skyscrapers of New York and Chicago. Moscow State University, one of the 7, remains the tallest educational building in the world. Beyond the historic center, Moscow extends for dozens of kilometers in every direction. The inner ring roads, the Garden Ring, and the Third Ring encircle successive layers of the city built in different periods. Soviet-era residential districts of identical concrete apartment blocks give way to newer developments of glass towers, which give way in turn to the outer suburbs, where the density drops, and the landscape begins to resemble the countryside that surrounds the city. Saint Petersburg was founded in 1703 by Peter the Great on marshy ground at the mouth of the Neva River, where it meets the Gulf of Finland. The location was chosen for strategic reasons. Peter wanted a window to the sea and a direct connection to Western Europe. The city was built on islands separated by channels of the Neva Delta, and the construction required driving wooden piles into the swampy ground to create stable foundations. An estimated 30,000 workers died during the first years of construction. The architecture Peter commissioned was deliberately European. He brought architects from Italy, France, and the Netherlands, and the result is a city center that looks unlike anything else in Russia. Wide avenues, pastel-colored Baroque facades, and canals crossed by ornamental bridges give the historic center a visual coherence that took more than a century to assemble. The city became the capital of the Russian Empire and remained so until 1918. The Hermitage Museum occupies the Winter Palace and 5 connected buildings along the Neva embankment. It holds around 3 million objects, of which only a fraction are on display at any time. The collection covers Egyptian antiquities, Greek and Roman artifacts, European paintings from the medieval period through the 20th century, and applied arts from across the world. The building itself, with its green and white Baroque exterior and gilded interior halls, is as much a part of the experience as the objects it contains. St. Petersburg sits at roughly 60 degrees north latitude, the same as southern Alaska. In June and early July, the sun barely sets. The sky remains light throughout the night, shifting through shades of pale orange and gray, without ever going fully dark. This period, known as the White Nights, lasts for several weeks and changes the rhythm of the city. People stay out later, events are scheduled at midnight, and the distinction between evening and morning becomes genuinely unclear. The city has flooded regularly throughout its history. The Neva is prone to storm surges that push water back up the river and into the streets. The worst flood on record in 1824 reached 4 meters above normal levels and damaged much of the city. A flood barrier across the Gulf of Finland was completed in 2011 after decades of construction, and is designed to protect the city from the most severe surges. Two of the most visited sites near St. Petersburg are palace complexes built by 18th century rulers who wanted residences outside the city. Peterhof sits on the Gulf of Finland, about 30 kilometers west of St. Petersburg. Peter the Great began its construction after visiting Versailles and deciding that Russia needed something comparable. The lower park contains a cascade of fountains running from the main palace down to a canal that leads to the sea. The central feature is the Grand Cascade, a series of gilded statues and water jets arranged on a stepped slope. Most of the fountains operate without pumps, using a gravity-fed system designed in the early 18th century that still functions today. Catherine Palace is located in the town of Pushkin, about 25 kilometers south of St. Petersburg. The facade is 300 meters long, painted blue and white with gilded decoration. The interior contains the Amber Room, a chamber whose walls were originally lined with amber panels, gold leaf, and mirrors. The original panels were looted by German forces during the Second World War and have never been recovered. The room visible today is a reconstruction completed in 2003, based on historical photographs and surviving fragments. The reconstruction took 24 years to complete. Both palaces were heavily damaged during the German occupation of the Leningrad region between 1941 and 1944. The restoration work that followed took decades, and in some areas is still ongoing. The gap between the original construction and the current state is part of what the sites communicate, whether or not that is the intention. Valam is an archipelago of around 50 islands in Lake Ladoga, the largest lake in Europe. The main island is about 30 kilometers long and contains a monastery that has functioned, with interruptions, for over 1,000 years. There are no roads connecting the islands to the mainland. Access is by boat in summer, and, when the ice is thick enough, on foot or by vehicle across the frozen lake in winter. The monastery was founded sometime in the 10th or 11th century, though the exact date is uncertain. It was destroyed and rebuilt multiple times over the following centuries, damaged by Swedish forces, abandoned during periods of political upheaval, and closed during the Soviet period when the surrounding territory became part of Finland and then reverted to Russia. Monks returned in 1989 as the Soviet Union was ending, and the community has been rebuilding and expanding since. The islands have a quality of stillness that comes from the combination of water, forest, and the absence of traffic. The interior of the main island is covered in old-growth spruce and pine, with paths connecting the central monastery to a series of smaller skeets, hermitage-style communities where monks live in more isolated conditions. Some of these skeets are closed to visitors. Others can be reached on foot by following trails through the forest. Lake Ladoga is large enough to generate its own weather. Storms can develop quickly, and the crossing from the mainland port of Sortavala takes around an hour in good conditions, but can be impossible when the lake is rough. The combination of access difficulty and religious significance gives Valam a character that more easily reached monasteries rarely have. Kiji is a small island in Lake Onega, the second largest lake in Europe after Ladoga. It contains an open-air museum of northern Russian wooden architecture, centered on the Church of the Transfiguration, which was built in 1714 and has 22 domes covered in aspen shingles. The church was constructed without metal fasteners. The logs were shaped and fitted using only axes, and the joints between them were designed to tighten as the wood expanded in wet weather. The island functions as a collection point for historic wooden buildings from the surrounding region. Houses, barns, windmills, and chapels have been relocated here from villages across the Karelia region, some of which no longer exist. The buildings represent construction techniques that were once common across northern Russia and are now largely gone from their original locations. In winter, Lake Onega freezes, and the island is accessible by hovercraft or, in the coldest months, by vehicle across the ice. The wooden buildings in winter, surrounded by snow and ice, give the island a different quality from the summer season, when boats bring large numbers of visitors from the regional capital Petrozavodsk. The church has been under continuous restoration for decades. The challenge is that the original construction methods are not fully understood, and using modern materials or techniques would compromise the historic integrity of the building. A team of craftsmen trained in traditional axework has been working on the restoration in sections, replacing damaged logs with new ones shaped using the same tools and methods as the original builders. Ruskiala is a flooded marble quarry near the Finnish border in the Republic of Karelia. Quarrying began here in the 1760s, and the marble was used in the construction of several major buildings in Saint Petersburg, including St. Isaac's Cathedral and the Mikhailovsky Castle. Operations continued for nearly 2 centuries before the quarry was abandoned in the 1960s. Groundwater gradually filled the excavated space, creating a lake roughly 500 meters long and up to 50 meters deep, with walls of exposed marble rising on all sides. The water in the canyon is clear and takes on a green-blue color from the marble and the depth. Walking trails run along the rim, and several points allow visitors to look directly down into the water from the cliff edge. In summer, kayaks navigate the canyon floor. In winter, the upper layers freeze while the deeper water remains liquid, and the ice takes on colors from the marble beneath it. The quarry also contains underground tunnels and chambers excavated during the mining period. Some are accessible by boat, entering through openings at water level. The tunnels are dark and cold, with marble walls that still show the marks of the tools used to cut them. The combination of the industrial history and the natural transformation of the site gives it a character that purpose-built tourist attractions rarely achieve. The surrounding forest is typical Karelian landscape, birch and pine on granite outcrops, with lakes and wetlands between the rocky ridges. The region around Ruskeala was part of Finland until 1940, and Finnish architectural traces remain in some of the older buildings in the area. The Curonian Spit is a narrow strip of land separating the Curonian Lagoon from the Baltic Sea. It is about 98 kilometers long and between 400 meters and 4 kilometers wide. The Russian section occupies the northern half, with the southern half belonging to Lithuania. The entire spit is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The spit is built almost entirely of sand, deposited by Baltic currents over several thousand years. The dunes on the seaward side reach heights of up to 60 meters and move slowly eastward as wind pushes the sand. In the 19th century, several villages on the spit were buried by advancing dunes. Reforestation efforts beginning in the same century stabilized much of the spit, but the largest dunes continue to shift. One section of forest on the Russian side contains trees that have grown in spiral and looping forms, their trunks bent into curves that have no clear natural explanation. Local theories include wind patterns, soil chemistry, and fungal infection. Scientists have not reached a definitive conclusion. The area is known as the Dancing Forest and is one of the more visited sections of the spit. The lagoon side of the spit is sheltered and calm, used by fishing boats from the small settlements along its length. The seaside faces the open Baltic, with waves and a constant wind that shapes both the dunes and the vegetation. The contrast between the two sides within a short walking distance captures something of the spit's unusual character as a landscape that exists at the edge of its own stability. The Trans-Siberian Railway connects most of what appears in this video. It runs from Moscow through Yekaterinburg, past the edge of the Altai, along the southern shore of Lake Baikal, and on to Vladivostok on the Pacific coast. The full journey takes about 7 days without stops. Through the window, the country changes slowly, forest giving way to steppe, steppe to taiga, taiga to the mountains above the sea. Russia is difficult to summarize because the parts do not add up to a single image. The volcanic peninsula in the Far East has nothing in common with the medieval churches of the Golden Ring. The Buddhist temples of Kalmykia share no obvious connection with the marble quarries of Karelia. The Caucasus Mountains and the Siberian Desert exist in the same country by the accident of history and conquest, not because they belong together in any natural sense. What connects them is the scale. Russia is large enough that contradictions simply coexist without needing to resolve. Climate zones, religions, languages, and landscapes that would be separated by borders in other parts of the world are here contained within a single administrative unit. That containment is sometimes comfortable and sometimes not, but it is what produces the range of places this video has moved through. There is more that was not covered, regions that would each fill their own video. The Arctic coast, the Volga Delta, the Jewish Autonomous Region, the abandoned Soviet space facilities, the communities that have lived in the far north for thousands of years. Russia does not run out of material, it simply runs out of time.